Copyright Frequency 99. Imprint Frequency 99, Ocala, Florida, USA. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual events or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Chapter 1. Parameters. Space Marine Drake's jets burned orange to slow him down after the drop. It was classified as a moon, but it was really just a very large rock in space. An atmosphere and gravity had been installed, so it was a rock with fake gravity and real air. Ships hung in space around it, a military shipyard. Some in dock, being repaired or upgraded, others waiting their turn, slowly circling way out there so as not to be in the way of anything. The stealth scout ship that Captain Thalia piloted sped off to rejoin the waiting ships. She knew the perfect hiding place, out in the open, with the other ships in line for their turn in dock, fully visible with no one bothering to look. The scout ship was small, just large enough for the 2 personnel it carried and the cargo they planned to return with. It had been a long journey from the inner planet, where General Magnius and the rebuilt war fleet were positioned. She was surprised that she and Drake had passed the time the way they had. As his superior officer, it was certainly within the regulations if she wanted, but it wasn't exactly how she typically did things. The two currently carried a bond. Thalia knew it was just chemicals and pheromones, that it would fade when the high-pressure situation was resolved. Still, the trip had been a pleasant enough diversion from the war effort and responsibilities as captain of the captured enemy space carrier, the new fleet's flagship, and the pressures of working for General Magnius. She watched Drake's jets continue to burn on the display screen, an integrated computer system with sophisticated combat technology. In a larger engagement, she could coordinate tactics and strategy with it as a central point of control. In this mission, that wasn't necessary, but the Combat Information Center, CIC, crossloads were still invaluable to their success. "I'm down," Commander Drake reported over the low-power direct communication link. Upon notification, Thalia hit a few more buttons on the console, and the display opened up into a map. The system would record all sensor inloads and store everything collected as a visual representation of the shipyard. Drake's location blinked green, and a series of indicators scrolled up the side of the display, showing different statuses for him and his combat armor. A separate warehouse location nearby blinked yellow. It was the mission target. Drake landed as close as he could without being observed in the industrial segment of the rock. He switched on his heads-up display, HUD, so that Thalia could see out the front of his armor from her position on the ship. The CIC system would scan the feed as well, providing outloads and notifications if it identified anything within the mission parameters. Drake did not carry any projectile weapons, only hand-to-hand edged bracings built into his combat armor. They had theorized, correctly, that if it came to a need to fire a shooter, they were both already dead, so there was no reason to deal with the extended logistics. "I'm reading 2 guards," Drake reported over the feed. "Damn, they're Makayans." Mushi was the name of their home moon. It was one of 5 that orbited the large round ice planet Tayo, the dominant planet in the dominant circle. Tayo had as moons all the original homes for each of the 5 races. Drake's combat armor carried local signal dampers, preventing enemy data or communication signals from escaping its small sphere of influence. "Do it," Thalia replied in their direct comm feed. Chapter 2. Friendly Fire. Drake watched the 2 guards for a few beats more than he should have. He was a professional soldier and trained killer, but this would be the first time he had ever used his skills, unprovoked, against members of his own moon, his own race. Sure, he had killed several Makians before, but only in promotion attempts or other social on-duty activities. Anyone of his rank would have similar experiences. You didn't become Combat Prime on the fleet's flagship without a few challenges. He put his feelings aside and moved forward, staying in the shadows. The combat armor was thick and strong, but it also had assisted movement and deep technical algorithms designed for stealth when needed in the field. Drake approached from behind. The 2 were lightly armored and not on high alert. Why would they be? They were guarding a shipyard deep in the dominant circle, and there was no war and no known threat. They were working for the enemy but might not know it. A small reprieve, if not a full justification for what Drake needed to do. He spun in from behind, gracefully decapitating the first guard, a tall female. Seeing the move, the second guard had just enough time for a flash of panic to cross his face. But Drake was already on him, and his head silently fell seconds later, the expression of panic frozen on its way to the ground. "Neutralized," he said into the comm feed. "Put it in the log that I'm officially a war criminal." It was a joke, but there was no humor in it. "Acknowledged," was all that Thalia returned, her voice neutral in his headset. Drake pulled the bodies out of view. He dragged one over, then the other, then had to make a third trip to retrieve the severed heads, holding one in each hand. He was a silhouette from the crosslights of the warehouse, but far enough away for the shadows to provide concealment. "Stop!" a voice pitched in from the direction of another warehouse behind Drake. "Who are you?" Drake slightly tilted his head to one side, and his rear view appeared in a window in his forward HUD. There were 2 more guards. These were Fovians, a competitor race for influence in the politics of the 5 Moons. Where Drake had killed only a few Machians, he had fought and killed hundreds of Fovians. "I can't get a comm signal," he heard one of the guards tell the other. He used the moment of uncertainty to attack, spinning and throwing a head at either guard. He raced toward them after turning and releasing the morbid projectiles. Once again, as slow realization formed on their faces, he was on them and had them neutralized, using the same method. Captain Thalia's voice blared into the comm, catching him by surprise. "Why didn't your scanners identify them?" It was an honest question he had just started to consider himself as he pulled the second set of guards out of visibility. These were Fovians. It looks like they are wearing some type of camo fatigues. Our CIC and combat HUDs are what? A full cycle out of updates? He said as he finished dragging the bodies. There was a short pause, then her voice returned. "Interesting. I am expanding our mission parameters. We need the power cores for the ships. I think we also need to inload some new CIC and HUD software patches. We can't come back guns blazing in a couple weeks and not be able to detect anyone with our equipment." Drake's HUD updated, and there were now 2 objectives in the lower right corner. The original objective to secure enough ship power cores for the dozens of ships they had repaired, and now the second objective of a software patch. Drake agreed with the decision, but his military sarcasm got the best of him. "If we add anything else to our shopping list, we're going to have to make 2 trips." The CIC system processed the new data, and after a moment, another building on the other side of the target warehouse turned yellow in his display. Drake paused and studied the new information. He had volunteered for this mission because he hated his role as an officer, and he hated the administrative and political elements of the job. He had received a field promotion during the final battle of the Abraxian conflict, the storming of the Abraxian carrier and fleet flagship. They had won the battle, but lost the war. He knew that saying but never understood the deep meaning of it until after those events. Worse, he had caught the eye of Magnius and Thalia, the 2 most senior officers, and they had promoted him from the enlisted ranks. Drake pointed out often to them that his promotion was due to his combat ability, yet it put him in a role where he spent more time filing fleet requisition forms for toilet paper than applying his unique skills. He had tracked the time. It was literally true. He was so bored and so irritated all the time, and so tired of returning salutes. As an enlisted soldier, he had learned to avoid officers, saluting them only when they infrequently crossed paths. Now, as an officer, he had to salute everyone, other officers and enlisted personnel either initiating or returning the gesture. Up, down, salute, salute, greeting of the day. What a waste of time. There was an old saying as an enlisted soldier about saluting. If it moves, salute it. If it doesn't move, pick it up. If you can't pick it up, paint it. He had been more of a painter before, valuable enough inside of combat to have his behavior ignored outside of it. The chance to get away and actually do something again was too much to pass up. Back in the here and now, he advanced slowly on the original target, the warehouse. While not happy that he had been forced to kill 2 people from his home moon, the situation itself had turned beneficial as it exposed the deficiency in his scanners. Since stealth was a key requirement for success, finding that out before he blundered into a room full of Fovians was good luck. The large rock the shipyard administration and storage were built onto rotated quickly on its axis, taking only about an hour to complete a rotation. This gave him an idea. "Captain, I should be able to push the ship power cores up to you in orbit and continue on to the administrative building for the codegram updates." This would be a change in plan. Originally, he was to get the power cores and simply fly back up to the ship with them, where they could speed away unnoticed. He couldn't drag the things around with him. He didn't want to try and get to the administrative building first, then return to the warehouse. And he certainly didn't want to have to make 2 trips to the ship like he had joked earlier. "We can make that work," Thalia chirped in over the comm. "I will get the CIC cross-loading the specifications for you to save time." Chapter 3. Easy peasy. The way into the warehouse was clear, and Drake made good time, cutting through a fence and entering the building from a loading dock. He left the bay door open, planning to return here as his way out. It was nighttime on the shipyard rock, a meaningless timekeeping tradition, other than it meant they were between work shifts, leaving the area empty. This is, of course, why Thalia and Drake decided to implement the mission now. They had a few hours before the next work shift came in. Drake moved through the inner storage area, using the scanners in his armor to detect and inventory the contents of the large room. He walked up and down each aisle, watching the inventory build on his HUD display. He knew Captain Thalia was seeing the same data, and that the CIC system on their ship was cross-loading as soon as each datagram was complete and inloaded. Even though there were several sets of eyes on the inventory, Drake still read each new line with grim determination. He had a sense of duty and a strong desire to be successful, no matter the mission. Drake had joined the military as soon as he was the minimum age. It wasn't so much that he had a sense of duty to his home world, although that was certainly there. It was more that he wanted to test his mettle and learn something about himself. The MDF military was a brutal, corrupt establishment with as much organized crime as a military powerhouse. He knew in joining that he would be tested and that he would discover what boundaries he had within him, if any. As it turned out, he found he was good at 2 things. The first was using combat technology. Some outsiders would say this meant he was good in combat. Drake would argue, and often had, with that simple summary. The technology level of the MDF was high. Just like now, the equipment and hierarchy had the mission surrounded. He didn't have to really focus on anything, just walk around the warehouse. Eventually, when his target was discovered or another high-value asset was analyzed, either the CIC system, Captain Thalia, or his local HUD would notify him. But he read the data anyway and paid attention anyway. Unlike most other soldiers, this meant that there was a good chance he would identify the situation at the same time, or before, any of the support mechanisms. It would make it seem like he was good at searching, but really, he was just smart enough to be present and participate more than he had to. Combat was the same way. He was good at using combat armor and technology. It was built for warfare, and he used it well, so people assumed that meant that he was good at warfare. The reality simply was that the MDF issued good pieces of gear, and where others put it back on the block when done, he took the time to understand it. The second thing he discovered about himself was that all the military posturing, put-downs, and situational chaos didn't bother him at all. If he were asleep at night during training, and they turned the lights on and started banging on the wall to roust everyone into some night exercise, he just got up and did it. What else was he going to do? A night exercise was certainly more interesting than sleeping in a bunk in a room with 50 other people. He didn't care. Not in a bad way, but in a good way. If the mission was to run around at night after only a few minutes sleep, then that was the mission. It was as simple as you allowed it to be. If a drill sergeant or officer were yelling at him, even with their clever barbs, some of which were pretty funny, other troopers may laugh or get their feelings hurt. Drake didn't care. He really only listened for key words. Are they telling him to do something? Are they providing important information for later? If not either of those, it was just noise to him. He learned that lesson during his first week of boot camp. His training platoon had been sent on a long run after an early wake-up. It was the first time they got a feel for running with all of their combat equipment on. These were the days before the fancy combat armor with assisted movements like he was using here now. The older gear added another 80 pounds to a soldier's frame. After returning to their barracks, exhausted from the exercise, and with only a short period of time to get ready and stand for their first inspection, they discovered their bunks and lockers had been kicked over and everything was disheveled. It would take longer than they had to put it all back together. Upon entering the room, Drake had remarked to the person next to him, "You know, I am pretty sure I remember making my bunk." Of course, a training instructor was standing behind him when he said it, so he spent the rest of the next week on double duty. That was the first and last comment he ever made about anything until he had some real rank, instead simply following orders, wherever they may lead. He also never put in for a single promotion. In the MDF fleet, the philosophy was that you could fight your way to the top, or any position you wanted, if you were a more skilled combatant than the person holding the rank or position now. Drake understood the underlying premise, but he didn't want responsibility. His promotions came from getting noticed and doing a good job. Once he made Combat Prime about a year ago, he had several challenges, forcing him to fight in single combat to keep his position. He considered many times purposely losing a match, but his stubbornness and pride kept him engaged and in the position, even though he didn't really want it. Drake stopped, snapping out of his introspection when a line crossed the bottom of his display. He noticed it before anyone else. There were a number of heavy military-grade ordnances, some hand cannons, and some fleet-grade concussion weapons of immense power. He was expecting Thalia's communication, and she came in right on time. "Commander, there are several crates of warheads to your right," Thalia said, businesslike, through the emitter into his ear in the helmet. "I see them," Drake returned, already having sized up the crates. They were small enough to fit into the ship along with the power cores. Thalia continued, "The system can't identify them specifically, but is surmising they are the same ordnance used at the end of the engagement near Pawan. The Abraxian swarm fleet had detonated warheads of incredible power to destroy the bulk of the MDF fleet in their final engagement. The MDF fleet had beaten the swarm fleet, but by detonating the warheads, the swarm had destroyed the victorious MDF. They had destroyed their own forces as well, essentially ending the conflict through the mutual destruction of both sides." Drake read the HUD. "There are a lot of warheads here, and they are so small. I would have thought something with that level of yield to be much larger." He spoke as much to Thalia as to himself, working through the discovery, trying to understand it. Captain Thalia took a few minutes to respond. Then, "Okay, Commander. We've found the power cores and have an additional target of opportunity. The ship won't hold anymore, so let's go ahead and secure these 2 items. No point in wasting any more time searching for something else we can't bring back." Drake agreed. He often agreed with Thalia. She was a seasoned officer and knew what she was doing. Life was easier when you had competent leadership. Drake picked up the several crates with the warheads, his combat armor doing the lifting. He moved them back outside to the loading dock, returned for the power cores, and eventually had a stack of 12 crates on the dock. This was 6 times more than they anticipated. The ship on the return trek would be near unlivable, but the CIC program calculated the ship could hold the cargo once Thalia reset the living parameters for her and Drake. She had it set so that the 2 of them would spend the next month within a small area with just enough room to sleep and stand. It was fine with Drake. He didn't care. His sense of duty kicked in. This was a way to exceed the mission parameters by a wide margin. He got great satisfaction out of a job well done. Working quickly in the exposed, well-lit outside area, Drake slapped a tracking tag on each crate. He allowed the CIC to download specifications into his combat armor. While the rock he was on felt like it had real gravity, and it did while close to the surface from the artificial technology that had been installed, the gravity field did not extend more than a few measures off the ground due to the programmed limitations of the generated field. This saved power and reduced logistics. Further, Gravity was not needed where people could not normally go. Drake picked each crate up after they were all tagged and activated the coroutine through his HUD. Each crate was thrust into the air using both arms, pushed with all the artificial force of the combat armor. The crates quickly rose outside of the gravity field, each precisely aimed so that Thalia could retrieve them in the ship's rear cargo bay. Drake paused between each box, knowing that she would need time on the other end to secure the cargo and prepare to receive the next one. Chapter 4: Fire and Forget. Thalia had the ship positioned to receive the crates as they arrived, slowly rotating perfectly into the cargo hold. She had turned the ship gravity off. There was no point in making the reception of the crates any harder than it had to be. Because of the lack of space, she had to quickly unbox the first several arrivals, pulling out the power cores and stashing them all over the ship. The extra inventory meant that she and Drake would have only one bunk, and the 2 chairs in the pilot's area on the return trip. It was worth the inconvenience, though. Adding in the small but powerful warheads could provide a tactical advantage in the battles to come. The cargo was well spaced out. Drake knew what he was doing and waited enough time before sending each next crate so that Thalia easily managed the work of receiving them without any catastrophe. Once everything was stowed, she closed the rear of the ship and reactivated the gravity. It was always tempting to leave the gravity turned off. You slept better and felt better, but your muscles and skeletal structure deteriorated if turned off for any amount of time. Thalia caught herself anticipating Drake's return to the ship. Damn, shake it off, she thought. What the heck was wrong with her? He was just another grunt in a long line of grunts. The feeling compelled her to return to her pilot's chair and check up on his progress. She would have done that anyway, but she found herself somehow more relieved in finding all the mission indicators green than she should have been. On the display, she could see that he was now making his way from the warehouse to the administrative building. His combat armor was going to be a problem in this next piece. It was excellent armor and had provisions for battlefield stealth that he had already demonstrated, but it was not made for walking through an office building and interacting with computer terminals. He could do it with no problem, but he would be wide out in the open the whole time. She had another quick twinge of feelings, and the thought of cancelling the acquisition of the CIC updates crossed her mind. It would be a bad decision, so she pushed it away. They had already achieved their primary objectives, exceeded them, even by also getting the warheads along with the ship power cores. She had them stowed in the ship, and the ship was far enough out that it would be near impossible for anyone or anything to prevent her escape. Unless she waited too long for Drake's return. She made a note in the CIC system to override her and automatically initiate the escape if she delayed her decision or placed Drake's well-being above mission success. Better to get that in there now while she was level-headed, she reasoned. Part of what made her a good soldier and even better officer was knowing herself and being aware enough to always put herself and her crew in the best position for success. The CIC had a flashing message in its queue, an observation it wanted to make Thalia aware of. She activated the message, and it showed that Drake had deviated from the mission parameters while she was loading the crates onto the ship. The trace line showed he went back to the 2 mushy guards he had neutralized earlier. Thalia opened the frequency. "Commander, we are in receipt of the cargo. Excellent work, thank you. The CIC is flashing a message to me that you deviated from the parameters while I was loading." She was more curious than worried. Drake's calm voice rang in. "Affirmative. The on-ground tactics have evolved, and I need a shooter, or I could need one, for this next part, so I went back to the guards and got theirs and the ammo from all 4 of them. It's just riot gear, non-lethal projectiles, but it's better than nothing." Thalia put her hand on her forehead. Of course, Drake knew of the vulnerability in the administrative area, just like she did, only he did something about it. Good thinking on his part. "Copy," she responded, updating the CIC datagrams to include that Drake was now equipped with both ranged and hand-to-hand capabilities. The CIC did not detect the change because the guards' weapons were not reporting into the system like a registered sidearm would. "Do you want me to deploy some drones to help with reconnaissance?" Thalia asked, the CIC recommending more approaches since the stealth parameter success rate had dropped significantly with the new objective. It took a few moments for Drake's reply. She knew him well enough to know the delay meant he was seriously considering it. Affirmative. His reply was hard to read. There was little inflection to it. Thalia nodded anyway and immediately tapped a few menus. 4 tiny round ball-shaped objects shot out of the ship heading to the spinning rock. They instantly fed a visual display into the CIC and into Drake's HUD. The feed to the CIC would allow the system to add to its datagrams and provide analytical crossloads to the configuration of the administrative building. Data started flowing in immediately as the 4 drones sped along their route, taking up position at the upper threshold of the artificial atmosphere. They needed to get inside the atmosphere to avoid the slight distortion it caused because of the air density. After just a few more quiet moments, the CIC console turned red. Thalia was shocked at what she saw. What was Wartech doing this far into the civilized areas of the luminary? It didn't matter why, just that it was there, and it was a killing machine heading straight for Drake's location. Emotion rose in Thalia again, shocking her. She had real feelings for Drake. Where did they come from? Did he feel the same way? Screw this, she deliberated. When Drake gets back, we're going to discuss my feelings and his and decide what to do. Chapter 5. Fight or Flight. Drake reflected that whatever programming nerd thought flashing red indicators and blaring audible warnings were the best way to communicate a problem, in the middle of the problem, needed to spend some time in the field actually doing the job. To counter this, he dampened the warning signals in his HUD. He had fought Wartech before. His combat suit seemed more upset about it than he was. Wartech was just one of several horrors left over from the first cycle, the barbaric first civilization in the Luminary. All of it was old tech, the worst of it Wartech, used by the Swarm, the fighting arm of the Abraxian military. Its sole purpose was to destroy life. It seems some thought went into ways to destroy life, while also driving fear into anyone else in the general area. Wartech killed in the most horrendous of ways imaginable. This particular model was a large suit operated by a swarm trooper from the inside. It was about twice the height of an average person, with huge spinning blades on the end of 2 arm-like protrusions and missile launchers along the front of the mean-looking machine. The last time Drake fought one, it killed a dozen Marines before they were able to neutralize it. He knew the thing would be a lot faster than it looked. Last time it had taken a full contingent of 20 Space Marines in full combat loadout, coordinating their fire, to take the thing down. All he had now was the non-lethal crowd suppression rifle he took off the Mashi guards and about 200 rounds of rubber bullets. Suddenly, Drake's HUD started screeching again, only this time not from its codegrams, but from the jamming algorithms emanating from the Wartech. Just like his technology had been jamming local space, the Wartech monster was now jamming him. The builders from an epoch ago were apparently more skilled than the engineers who built his brand new combat armor. He might lose the electronics battle, but he was dead set on winning the engagement. On first analysis, there was no way to beat this thing with the crowd suppression non-lethal shooter. There would be no amount of rubber bullets that could make any difference whatsoever. Drake knew it. He could avoid the monster and try and continue the mission, or run from it. His first instinct was to try and work his way to the administrative building, find a computer unit with the codegrams they needed, and then somehow escape. But that was not going to work. It would never work with this thing on his tail. The presence of Wartech deep in the dominant circle also meant that the Abraxian swarm was present. It never occurred to him, or Thalia, or even Magnice, that there would be any Abraxian involvement at a Fovian military shipyard. Yes, they all knew a deal had been made, but this suggested the scope of the deal, and the level of corruption within the governments of the 5 moons was several orders of magnitude worse than their most pessimistic assumptions. Drake studied the situation, and there was only one real option. He didn't want to do it, but the hand had been dealt, and all he could do was fold. He decided to return to the ship. They had already exceeded mission parameters. so he started to run. He ran in the opposite direction from the Wartech. His nerves were on him. This went against some deep-down instincts. He just wasn't used to it. The thought of another month alone on the ship with Thalia had him. He wanted that. For the first time ever, he had something he cared about. He wasn't putting himself or his feelings first, but he was allowing them into the equation. He knew he was lucky this time, because it spurred him to act correctly. But this created a weakness he would need to address if things progressed on the return trip. He had no idea how that might be done, so he pushed the thoughts away. There would be plenty of time to deal with the relationship after the mission here on this stupid rock. He sprinted in the opposite direction of the Wartech, climbing onto a building where he should be able to get high enough to jump outside the gravity well and get back into space. Something wasn't right, though. His armor might be starting to malfunction. It was becoming harder and harder to climb and move. He reached the top of the building, still sprinting, and leaped high in the air, firing his thrusters. Instead of arcing over the horizon and heading into space, he crashed back down to the ground, rolling as he landed, recovering his wits just in time to avoid disaster. His HUD reported that gravity was now 5 times normal in the warehouse district. He realized right away that had he not been wearing his combat armor, he would be lying on the ground, finding it difficult to move. 5 times gravity was not enough to injure you, but it was enough to make it exhausting to move for any extended amount of time without an exoskeleton like the armor. Since they had increased the gravity, it meant that more Wartech would be on its way. Trying his comm again, they were still jammed. He could not even ask Thalia for help or communicate with her for advice. His HUD had received some datagrams from the drone's scanning before losing contact with the CIC system, and his local system had been collecting a lot of data the whole time he had been deployed in the mission. This was one of those times where he would have to depend on himself and his immediate resources. The system was blinking some messages in the emergency queue. He had turned it all off when it started blaring warnings about the Wartech. The system was trying to remind him that there were heavy weapons in the warehouse where he had found the fuel cells and the explosive ordnance. Right, Drake thought. He had seen that, but not thought anything of it at the time, too focused on the heavy fleet weaponry. Like he always said, the MDF had good gear. His HUD may have just saved him. Yellow flashed into his display. He could make the warehouse. He was heading right for it. He ran, using the strength of the combat armor in the amplified gravity. Chapter 6. Hand Cannons. The weaponry in the crates was modern stuff. It integrated perfectly with his system physically and the HUD electronically. He grabbed 2 hand cannons, big short shooters that fired small round projectiles with very high yields. The ammunition shot straight, although you had to arc it at extreme range. The 2 devices plugged into his armor easily, using the standard interface as a universal fit. He loaded the armor with as much ammunition as it could carry. He saw more of the fleet-based heavy ordnance also in close-by crates. The individual shells were not much bigger than the hand cannon ammo, but they glowed a deep green and bright yellow. They looked dangerous. If this was, in fact, what the swarm had detonated at the end of the last huge fleet engagement, it was some kind of never-before-seen Wartech that he had never even heard of before. He put 5 of the shells in a side compartment in his torso. He heard a crash near the front entrance to the warehouse. His HUD was flashing red in a circle as fast as it could. If he had not disabled the accompanying noise, it would be blaring and distracting, and he was glad that he did turn it off. He had everything he needed, so he dropped the crates and ran for the rear exit. The next short little bit would be over the part of the rock he knew. He was heading back the way he had come in. As he ran, he watched the HUD display. The Wartech machine was barreling through the warehouse, then slowed down and made a wide circle around the fleet ordnance he had just opened, then picked up speed again. It was absolutely being careful. That stuff must really be dangerous. Drake smiled to himself as he ran. The irony that he had put 5 of the small round devices in his combat armor torso was not lost on him. If these nightmares did manage to kill him, he was going to blow sky high and maybe take the whole rock with him. Irony aside, He needed a plan. If they kept the gravity up, none of the buildings were high enough for him to use to jump out. Suddenly, a blaring voice rang out, broadcasting through some speaker system in the area. "Intruder, this is your only warning. Surrender now, or we will use deadly force. There is no chance of escape." He really needed access to the CIC program. If this were a larger coordinated assault, the strategy would be to eliminate obstacles directly in the way of success. Here, it was the artificial gravity technology. His training had him wanting to search for it and disable it. But he had no way to do that using just his local scanners and the HUD system. It was frustrating. He grew angry at the situation. "Stop running," he said to himself. "If they want to play, let's play." The HUD was blinking green, suggesting it was done cross-loading, and it concluded the hand cannons possessed enough firepower to combat the Wartech machine. Local HUD processing took much longer than the CIC system. He stopped at the fence opening he had cut before and turned. The huge, evil-looking machine was just emerging on the loading dock from inside the warehouse. It spotted him and leaned forward, its twin blades spinning in a circle on either arm. He started to take aim to fire, then stopped, frantically searching through HUD menus instead. "I almost blew it," he said to himself. He found the setting and updated the system to calculate aiming solutions using 5 times normal gravity. While Drake fiddled with settings, the Wartech started running directly at him. After a few steps, it started firing mortar shells out of its forward-facing projectile openings. The bombs didn't go far, only about a fifth of the way between the machine and Drake. The difference between mortars and missiles was that missiles were self-propelled, where mortars relied on an initial primer to launch the ordnance, then gravity to direct the bomb to the target. The Wartech operator had failed to compensate for the increased gravity that its handlers were using to keep Drake from escaping the moon. Drake, on the other hand, had just made the adjustment in his system. The Wartech machine stopped its advance, its misfired ordnance exploding and creating huge holes in the foundation it would have to go around. Drake did not wait for the small rocks and debris to clear before he started firing the twin hand cannons. The devices fired up to 3 small round bombs at a time. His combat armor was able to reload them automatically for him. The arc to the projectiles looked odd on observation, aimed at a very steep arc, not going very high and twisting down to the ground at an accelerated angle, all because of the increased gravity. However, his aim was true, and 6 heavy explosions followed the projectile's impact, 3 from each hand cannon in each hand. Drake kept moving, working his way to the far side of the new crater created by the Wartech misfire, keeping it between him and the enemy. The machine stumbled a bit, so Drake quickly fired another volley, 6 more shells following the same odd arc. He had it stunned, but he could not tell how much damage he had done. The inside of the thing must be ringing like a gong with the concussion and noise of the impacts. He fired a 3rd volley before it could recover, and the final impact did the trick. The machine buckled and fell to the ground, one of its legs at an odd angle. Its twin blades spun as it fell over, hitting the ground and breaking off, flying out in pieces in different directions. Drake was still being jammed, so he fired a 4th volley into the stationary downed frame, finally destroying its hard outer skeleton and smashing its power cores. "Are you there?" Thalia's voice suddenly rang into his headset. "I'm here," he responded quickly, not knowing how much time they had on the channel before it might be jammed again. 2 more large red circles appeared on Drake's HUD as the first one faded away. They were originating from the same location, a good way off. He had a few moments before they would be within jamming range. "Abort the mission, Commander," Thalia said earnestly over the peer-to-peer frequency. "Return to the ship." "Negative, Captain," Drake yelled as he ran. "The mission is already over. They've increased the gravity. I can't reach escape velocity. You need to get away now. If they know I am here, they know you are there." "William," Thalia said, using his first name for the first time. He cut her off. "I know," he said stoically. "Looks like it's not meant to be." The signal was dead, blocked by the approaching Wartech machines. He didn't know how much of his last message she had received, but it didn't matter. She had her job to do, and he had his. Chapter 7. Escape. "I know, looks like. The transmission went dead, jammed from near its source on the shipyard moon. Thalia stared at the control panel in the cockpit of the scout ship, her mouth open. Suddenly, explosions rocked the small craft. She slammed the side stick forward and the throttle to maximum velocity. The craft shot away. Thalia pulled herself out of her contemplation and activated the shield system to protect the ship from another volley. There was no need for stealth or covert tactics now. Trying not to call attention to herself would be pointless. They were directly tracking her. The small scout had good armor and armaments for a ship of its size, but it would be no match for any of the larger warships in line at the shipyard. I must do something. I can't just run away, she thought to herself. Command, Thalia stated, initiating the interface to the CIC program. Locate the gravity support system for Target 1. She knew she could not save Drake at this point, but she could give him a fighting chance as she made her escape. A yellow circle started blinking on the opposite side of the small moon. Command, deactivate safety protocols. She turned off the safeguards she had put in place for herself to avoid this very scenario. A flight path faded into existence on the ship's HUD. It was a winding and arching path, forecasting the route she would need to take to avoid the ships that were starting to move in pursuit. She tagged the trailing scout ship as Threat 1 in the system. The explosions had been from missiles fired from the small scout-class ship that was in pursuit of her. In some ways, she knew she was lucky. Had the enemy waited and tried for a more coordinated initial surprise attack, they could have possibly destroyed her craft while she was distracted. The ship's HUD was flashing a damage report. The initial impact was jarring and had reduced the ship's overall structural integrity. No specific systems were damaged, which was more good luck. Thalia piloted the craft straight for the opposite side of the moon, taking an abbreviated arc, not bothering with countermeasures or defensive navigation. She was relying on speed and surprise. Heading at the moon, instead of away from it, would not be what had been expected. Two smaller single-person fighters launched from the moon, heading straight at her. She quickly brought up the targeting display and tagged both as Threat 2 and Threat 3. She didn't bother with the larger ships in the area. She would be gone before they were able to get organized and make a turn to attack her. Plus, they outclassed her in every way. So there was no need to tie the CIC up with continually cross-loading firing solutions for ships she would never attack. Thalia's stealth scout had two primary types of munitions. The first was scattershot that she could fire at close range. It was not anything overly sophisticated, but it was wildly effective, simply small-caliber rounds of metal packed into small canisters. When fired, an artillery pressure charge propelled them out into space in a narrow arc. They could cause great damage to both shielding and ship armor. The second was a limited number of larger fire-and-forget, FF missiles, sometimes also called friend or foe missiles. It had the same abbreviations of FF. These projectiles had onboard propulsion and enough computer processing to maneuver after a dedicated target. You could fire and forget about them, knowing they would do the work to maximize the chance for a successful impact, or fire them even when an enemy ship was in close quarters with a friendly ship, as the missile was able to discern enemy ships from allied ships. The fighters were employing the same tactics as her, flying straight at her. The CIC system was not able to identify the make or model of the fighters in its database, so she did not have information concerning their exact capabilities. When in doubt, go all out, she found herself thinking. Basic combat techniques taught by General Magnus in one of his brutal training sessions. She hit the afterburner, and the ship jumped forward again, moving at a highly accelerated pace. She timed the scattershot discharge to be shot too early, firing it in a wide arc on the outside of her flight path to either side. She then pulled back on the side stick as fast as she could. The fighters had launched their own FF missiles, but her trajectory and arc made it impossible for them to make any meaningful adjustment before they had each shot by her. Her plan was to redirect the flight of the two fighters back into the path she had taken. It worked, both ships quickly rotating in to avoid the area of space that contained the scattershot. It was a graceful move by both pilots working together. However, the trailing scout Threat 1 was suddenly there in her place. accelerating to the limit of its engines. The Scout Threat 1 and the Fighters Threat 2 and Threat 3 collided in space. After the smallest moment of implosion from their pressurized cabins losing their seal, a huge explosion blew out in a large circle from the point of impact. Thalia wasn't that far away. The concussion wave shot over her ship, forcing the rear of the ship up as she sped forward, her new trajectory doing its job of minimizing the impact. After the wave cleared, she reoriented the ship, now on a different approach path to the gravity generator. When close enough, she released a single FF missile, and then she and the ship sped off into space at maximum velocity. Chapter 9. Keep it simple. One of the first things they taught you at boot camp was to focus on what you needed to do. It sounded simple, but it could be the hardest thing in the world. But when first becoming a soldier, everything was hard. You had to relearn how to do the simplest of things all over again. How to walk, how to make your bed, how to extend a greeting, how to talk in a land full of acronyms. Drake reflected on his training as he watched Thalia pilot the Scout, expertly handling the pursuing ship and the fighters that had been dispatched to destroy her. He watched her zoom by and fire a missile. He assumed she was trying to destroy the gravity generator, and he appreciated the effort. He felt the impact of the missile in the ground. The entire moon vibrated with its force. He watched his HUD, keeping an eye on the two approaching Wartech machines and the gravity reading from the sensors. After a few moments, the ground rumble stopped. Nothing else changed. He waited another moment, then assumed it meant the missile missed its target, or that their analysis was wrong, and the gravity field was controlled by a different power source. Either way, it meant the same thing for him. He watched the fighters take off from a location not too far from his current position. The underlying psychology of military training was to focus on what you needed to get done, not what you didn't. The brain could not be told what not to do, only what to do. It was a results-oriented organ. The drill instructors proved that the philosophy was right in a simple example. Don't think about sleep, they had told Drake and his training battalion at one point. Of course, the first thing Drake did was to think about sleep as soon as they said the word. It wasn't possible to avoid the quick visual flash and deep desire for sleep. Sleep deprivation was another tool the drill instructors used early on, so it was the perfect example of their point. Instead, they explained, think about what you need to accomplish to get what you want. If you wanted to sleep, what did you have to do to make that happen? Drake remembered slowly realizing what the true lesson was. If you thought about dropping out of a run, then that was what you focused on. It was the thing most likely to happen. However, if you thought about finishing the run, and that was what you had your brain focused on, that was much more likely to happen. Don't think about how tired you are. Think about how much energy you have left. Don't think about failing the course. Think about the joy of having it completed. He applied the same logic to the here and now, not focusing on his rescue, but instead on how much damage he could bring to bear with the enemy. Through his inner dialogue, he was still moving. No destination in mind, just looking more for a favorable environment. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but decided he would know it when he saw it. Sure enough, he came to an intersection of 4 two-story buildings. They met at a crossroads, forming a plus sign, one building on each corner. He had adapted to how to move in his combat armor in the increased gravity, so he was making good time. The trick was that there was a delay to most everything as the armor slowed against the higher strain of gravity. Moving to the corner of one of the structures, he used the strength of the armor to hold on to either side of the building corners and shimmied his way up to the second-story rooftop. When he climbed over the edge of the roof, he was surprised to see a dozen Fovian guards waiting for him. They were wearing the same light camouflage armor that the two he had originally encountered were. Whatever it was good enough to avoid the sensors in his armor. They all collectively opened fire, releasing small-caliber projectiles from their hand shooters. He was struck several times, the armor absorbing the brunt of the impact, but bending and denting in places where the blows landed dead on. Drake fell to one knee, recovering as quickly as he could. The 2 hand cannons were attached to his back. It would take too long and be awkward now to try and use them, so he activated his arm bracings. He could feel the enemy rounds impacting the external armor and breaking through in a few places. There was no mystery to it. Where they penetrated the armor, they dug into him, and it hurt. With all his will and strength, he righted himself and ran forward into the single line of enemy guards. Something wasn't right with one of his legs, so he charged slower than he wanted, but it was still an effective enough advance, breaking into the enemy line and using the sharp blades to disable or decapitate the guards. He charged the middle of the line, as he had been taught in training. By charging into the middle of the formation, it neutralized the enemy shooting from the outer positions. They could not continue to fire into their own ranks. Drake's armor injected him with a combat stimulant. Detecting that fatigue from the effort and damage from the growing number of wounds had him teetering on blacking out. Immediately after the injection, Drake started moving faster, spinning and twisting his way through the dozen guards, finally downing the last one. The scene was a bloody mess. Bleeding bodies, severed limbs, and other odd parts had fallen all over the rooftop. Drake's armor was covered in enemy blood and guts, mixed with his own blood seeping out of several impact holes. His HUD system was blinking red on every indicator. He went down to one knee. The red HUD indicators expanded as the two circles that represented the war tech showed close to the base of the building he was on. Drake marveled briefly that the fleet ordnance he had stowed in his armor torso was still untouched. He began to wish it had been. It would have ended his fight in grand style. Think about what you need to do. This wasn't the first time Drake had been in a tough combat situation. Every time he found himself in a bad situation, the more his basic training came back to him, and this time was no different. Fundamental rules and outlooks helped ensure the best chance of survival. He shook off the wistful thoughts about the fleet ordnance and brought up his HUD menu again. One thing that was good about the HUD still being operational was that it would give him unbiased data. He knew he felt terrible, but he could look at the HUD monitoring metrics to get the real story. The combat armor had started to repair what it could from the damage it sustained in the firefight, releasing liquid metal here and there to close the areas that had been penetrated, sealing wounds on his body with what basically amounted to glue, injecting stimulants into his bloodstream to keep him awake and able to function, reducing the pain as much as possible. He knew at this point that he could not risk an engagement with the two Wartech machines. He was lucky with the first one, its operator not compensating for the increased gravity they were using to keep him from escaping. What do I need to do? What do I want? He asked himself. He wanted to be back on the small, cramped ship with Thalia. His injuries were severe, and he needed to focus. When he snapped himself back, he found he was running, no longer on the rooftop. His HUD display was blinking red everywhere, but his vital signs had turned a bright dark orange. He tried to read it, but couldn't make any sense out of it. He could see numbers and some words, but it seemed his blood loss was impacting his cognitive abilities. He was having a hard time thinking. What do I need to do? He turned the HUD off and removed his helmet, breathing in the crisp, cold air of the small moon for the first time. Everything smelled like fire and smoke. He dropped the helmet and kept moving as fast as he could, even though he couldn't remember where he was going. He wasn't exactly running anymore. His movements were more an expedited hobbling. Looking back, he could see the two Wartech machines closing in. They were not moving as fast as they could. Instead, their gait was a confident stride, approaching downed prey, letting the moment last. What do I want? It was a basic question. He didn't remember why he was asking it. The Wartech approached, now within artillery range with their front mortars. But they didn't fire them, instead each extending their spinning blades forward. They would be on him in a few moments. He could hear the hum of the blades as they gained speed. What do I need to do? Drake had a last moment of clarity. He was on his knees with no memory of falling to them. He reached onto his back and secured one of the hand cannons. The move itself hurt, and he felt something rip under his arm. He pressed the muzzle against his torso where he had stored the fleet ordnance. What do I want? Then he remembered. He wanted to win. Chapter 10. The inner planets. The trip back to the fleet was miserable, as Thalia was alone with her thoughts for nearly a month. As her small scout ship neared the inner planet Hunkal, she could see the repaired space fleet in stationary orbit around the lifeless sphere. The fleet was magnificent, the large old-tech carrier flagship, her ship, glinting in the middle of the formation, the luminary brightly shining off its repaired surfaces. Only Magnus could have marshalled so much effort from so few resources. The fleet just a year ago was only remnants and battered ships, disabled in the last fleet encounter with the Abraxian swarm. They had repaired nearly 5 dozen ships, all gunships and destroyers, but a large fighting force nonetheless. What they lacked in intermediate warships like corvettes and frigates, they made up for in sheer numbers. They would not be the fastest fleet or the nimblest, but they could hit as hard as any fighting force in the luminary. Thalia was still several days out, but close enough for real-time communications. General Magnus was on the screen in front of her. She had gotten herself together, and now presented as she always did. A picture of military discipline and readiness. "Yes, sir," she was saying. "I saw the whole shipyard explode, the moon it was on and most of the ships in dock. Some waiting ships were farther out, but the blast took out a large contingent of them." Magnus was nodding his head, watching Thalia closely. She knew he could tell something was wrong, but she also knew that deep down, he did not really care. His only concern was to determine if she had been compromised. Magnus looked down at another display, then back to Thalia. "I see from the inventories you procured a decent supply of power cores. Good work, Captain." "Thank you, sir." She felt a tug in her gut. She did honestly feel pride in receiving his praise. He said what he meant. There were never simple niceties. If he said good work, it meant that it had been good work. Simple and direct. Magnus continued, "I do have a matter I would like your opinion on, Captain. The Machi Council has acknowledged my rank and requested a meeting to discuss a counterattack against the swarm." He paused for just a moment. "They want the meeting to take place on Machi." After securing the battered ships and the barely functional swarm old-tech space carrier, Magnus had field-promoted himself to general. He simply declared it. A brazen, bold, and arrogant move, but very in keeping with his ambitions. Thalia reacted instantly, any past concerns and a month of near depression gone in the moment. This was why she followed Magnus. He moved things forward. "Sir, you and I both know it's a trap. They have sold out." Magnus nodded. "Here is my thinking, Captain." He looked down again at some other display, then back into the communication terminal. "Our grievance is not with our people. We are not enemies to the people of Machi. I have spent a good amount of time thinking about this. If we are to save our home, really save it, and liberate it from its oppressive government and the threat of the Abraxians, we have to have the trust of our citizens. They don't fully understand how corrupt things have become. And no one knows about the secret deal made. No one would believe that they have been sold out and that they are simply now a food crop." A flash of inner resolve crossed his face. The only way for this to work is to be able to show that we tried to work within the rules as they understand them. We must publicly confront the councils and the truth-tellers. We have to be seen as the ones speaking truth, not them. I cannot think of any other way, outside of using force against our own people, which even I will not contemplate yet. Thalia sat back in her chair, deep in thought. Neither she nor Magnus was very good at politics outside of a military framework. An immediate concern crossed her mind. What would we do with the fleet? We can't approach Machi with a war fleet and gain the trust you seek. Magnus tilted his head. We have enough androids to maintain the fleet until we return. They are mostly running everything anyway. There are not enough of us to staff all the ships now. We need crew, which is another reason to return to Machi. Thalia looked directly into the feed. I don't like it, she said, meaning it. Magnus grinned. I hate it, Captain, but it's the only way I can think of. They talked for a while longer, going over details. Eventually, the conversation ended, and Thalia signed off. She slumped back in her chair, allowing her uniform to wrinkle. Tears streamed down her cheeks, coming from nowhere. She had only ever cried a few times in her life, but suddenly, she could not stop. She vowed never to allow herself to have feelings again. They just got in the way. There was too much to do, and Magnius would keep her busy with important work. The luminary fell behind the planet Hunkal as she angled the small craft in for approach. She had a while yet to grieve before they docked. Once back on the carrier, she would start fresh and direct her anger at the Abraxians. They were the true enemy, and she would do everything she could to destroy them and save her people. The end. Dictionary. Alethea, third planet from the luminary, blue planet, 71% water. Alterial, an environment created entirely in the ether, alternate reality. Beitor, moon with heavy gravity orbiting Taio, one of the 5 moons of civilization. Beitorian, a person from Beta. Codegram, a self-contained set of operating instructions. Cogitate circle, the overarching administrative government of the entire luminary circle. Crossload, to process a datagram or other set of inloads. Cycle, the amount of time it takes a body in the luminary to rotate around its gravitational anchor. Datagram, a self-contained ether database, storage, and network singularity. Ether, the technology that monitors and guides everything in the luminary circle. Ether holo, a projection of a real person or android in the alterial ethereal, a component of the ether that exists in the real world. This is used exclusively to identify a cybernetic being built fully integrated into the ether. Ethereal series, the model of the ethereal fabric, the technology used to connect to the ether. First cycle, the time period identified with the prior civilization. Fovian, a person from Fovis. Fovis, dominant moon orbiting to Taio, one of the 5 moons of civilization. Inload, accept input. Luminary, sun. Luminary circle, solar system. Mass small moon orbiting Taio, one of the 5 moons of civilization. Machian, a person from Mashi, microcycle, micros, a smaller unit of measure somewhere between what we call seconds and minutes. Old tech, technology left over from a prior civilization. Outload, send output. Taio, large ice planet that the 5 moons of civilization orbit. Measure, a standard unit of distance or weight. War tech, old tech from the first cycle, specifically built for killing biologicals. Brutal inventions built only for war and murder.